The Roman disaster at Cannae. In 216 BC, Rome faced one of the worst defeats in its history at the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal, the Carthaginian commander, had already shocked the Romans by crossing the Alps and bringing the war into Italy. Rome responded with a massive army, hoping that overwhelming numbers would finally crush him. The Roman plan seemed simple: pack their infantry into a dense formation and smash through Hannibal's center. On paper, it looked powerful. In reality, it gave Hannibal exactly what he needed. He placed his weaker center forward and allowed it to bend backward under Roman pressure without breaking. As the Romans pushed deeper, his stronger African infantry on the sides turned inward. Meanwhile, Carthaginian cavalry defeated the Roman horsemen and attacked from behind. The Romans had marched into a trap shaped like a battlefield. Cannae became famous for the double envelopment, a maneuver where an army is surrounded from both sides and the rear. Ancient casualty numbers vary, but the scale of the defeat was enormous, and Cannae became one of the classic examples of how numbers can become useless when they are compressed, surrounded, and unable to maneuver. Rome's mistake was not simply losing a battle. It was assuming that size could solve strategy. Hannibal turned Roman strength into Roman weakness, using their mass against them until the army became too crowded to escape. The Teutoburg forest ambush. In AD 9, Rome believed it was extending control deeper into Germanic territory. The Roman commander Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions through the forests of Germania, trusting local guidance and assuming the region could be managed like a province already under Roman order. That assumption proved disastrous. Arminius, a Germanic leader who had served with the Romans and understood their methods, secretly organized a rebellion. He used his knowledge of Roman confidence, roads, marching habits, and command structure against them. Varus was drawn into difficult forested terrain where the Roman army could not deploy in its usual disciplined formations. The weather, mud, trees, and narrow paths weakened the Roman advantage. Instead of open battlefield order, the legions faced repeated attacks along a stretched marching column. The Romans were not defeated in one clean clash. They were broken through confusion, terrain, and a betrayal they had failed to detect. The destruction of the legions in the Teutoburg forest became a psychological shock for Rome. It helped stop major Roman expansion east of the Rhine and showed that even the most disciplined army in the ancient world could be ruined when it entered hostile terrain with false confidence. Varus made the fatal error of believing political control existed before it truly did. The forest proved otherwise. Rome had roads, armor, and legions. Arminius had patience, local knowledge, and the advantage of choosing where the fight would happen. The Charge of the Light Brigade. The Charge of the Light Brigade became one of the most famous examples of a misunderstood order turning into disaster. During the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War in 1854, British commanders intended to prevent Russian forces from removing captured guns. But the order was unclear, the battlefield was difficult to see from different positions, and communication between commanders broke down. The Light Brigade, a British cavalry force, was sent charging down a valley directly toward heavily defended Russian artillery instead of the intended target. The soldiers rode forward under fire from 3 directions. Cannon struck from the front and sides. The charge showed extraordinary courage, but courage could not fix the mistake that had already placed them in the wrong position. The event became immortalized through Alfred, Lord Tennyson's poem, but the real story was not romantic. It was a failure of command clarity under battlefield pressure. The confusion over the order has remained a central part of the episode. The Light Brigade attacked strong Russian positions in the wrong valley, and responsibility for the miscommunication has been debated ever since. What makes this moment so shocking is the contrast between obedience and error. The cavalrymen followed orders with discipline. The disaster came from the order itself. In battle, bravery can carry men forward, but if command sends them in the wrong direction, bravery becomes part of the tragedy. Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign began with a bold idea: force a passage through the Dardanelles, weaken the Ottoman Empire, open a supply route to Russia, and possibly change the course of World War I. In theory, it promised a way to break the deadlock away from the Western Front. In practice, it became one of the war's most painful Allied failures. The campaign started with naval attacks in February 1915, followed by landings on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April. Allied planners underestimated the difficulty of the terrain, the strength of Ottoman defenses, and the challenge of supporting troops on narrow beaches under fire. The cliffs, ridges, heat, disease, water shortages, and dug-in defenders turned the operation into a grinding struggle. The mistake was not a single wrong order. It was a chain of optimistic assumptions. Planners expected movement where the land made movement brutal. They hoped naval power could solve a strategic problem that required coordinated ground success. They underestimated Ottoman resilience and gave defenders time to prepare. Gallipoli ended with evacuation, not victory. For Britain and France, it became a lesson in poor planning and unrealistic expectations. For Australians and New Zealanders, it became a defining national memory. For the Ottoman side, it elevated commanders such as Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. A campaign designed to open a route instead became a warning. Geography can defeat ambition before the enemy even needs to. Pearl Harbor's missed warning. On the morning of December 7, 1941, radar operators at the Opana station on Oahu detected a large formation of aircraft approaching the island. The warning came before the attack on Pearl Harbor began. But the sighting was misinterpreted as incoming American B-17 bombers expected that day, rather than the first wave of Japanese aircraft. This was not the only issue. Pearl Harbor was a failure of readiness, intelligence interpretation, communication, and imagination. The United States knew tensions with Japan were extremely high, but the precise location and timing of the attack were not understood in time. Aircraft were parked close together, ships were concentrated in harbor, and warning signs did not produce an effective defensive response. The Japanese attack devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and pulled the United States fully into World War II. The shock was not only that the attack happened, but that so many signs had failed to become action. Pearl Harbor remains one of history's most studied surprise attacks, because it shows how information alone is not enough. A signal on a radar screen has no power unless the system around it understands what it means and reacts quickly. The mistake was not that no one saw anything. Someone did. The tragedy was that the warning arrived, passed through human assumptions, and lost its meaning before the bombs fell. Operation Barbarossa. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, it began one of the largest invasions in military history. Adolf Hitler expected a rapid victory. German forces advanced quickly at first, capturing huge areas and inflicting massive losses. But the campaign was built on dangerous assumptions. German planning underestimated Soviet endurance, industrial capacity, manpower reserves, geography, and political will. The invasion stretched supply lines across enormous distances. Roads were poor, rail systems had to be converted, fuel and ammunition became harder to move, and the weather turned against the invaders. German forces had expected a quick Soviet collapse, and were not properly equipped for winter warfare when the campaign dragged on. The mistake was strategic arrogance. Germany treated the Soviet Union as an enemy that would break under one massive blow. Instead, the war expanded into a struggle of distance, industry, manpower, weather, and ideology. By December 1941, German forces were stopped outside Moscow, and the Soviet counteroffensive shattered the idea of an easy victory. From that point, the Eastern Front became a war of attrition on a scale Germany could not sustain. Operation Barbarossa shows how early success can hide a failing plan. The invasion moved fast enough to create confidence, but not fast enough to win. Germany had opened a war too large for its own assumptions. The fall of Singapore. In early 1942, Singapore was considered one of Britain's most important strongholds in Asia. It had a major naval base and was often described as a fortress. But when Japan attacked through Malaya and advanced towards Singapore from the landward side, British confidence collapsed. The British had expected Singapore's main danger to come from the sea. Heavy defenses were focused on naval attack, while the jungle and land route from the north were underestimated. Japanese forces moved rapidly down the Malay Peninsula, using speed, air superiority, bicycles, infiltration, and aggressive tactics to keep defenders off balance. By the time the Japanese crossed into Singapore, British and Commonwealth forces were exhausted, disorganized, and short of options. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore on February 15, 1942. The fall became one of the greatest defeats in British military history and a massive blow to imperial prestige. The shock came from the difference between reputation and reality. Singapore looked powerful on maps and in speeches. But a fortress is only as strong as the assumptions behind its defense. If the enemy attacks from the direction planners dismissed, the entire idea of security can collapse. Singapore's fall proved that fixed defenses and imperial confidence were not enough against a fast-moving opponent willing to fight differently. The British had prepared for the wrong version of the war. Operation Market Garden. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan that aimed to end the war in Europe more quickly. Airborne troops would capture key bridges in the Netherlands, while ground forces pushed rapidly north to cross the Rhine and enter Germany. The concept was daring. If everything worked, Allied forces could bypass major German defenses and open a route into the heart of the enemy's territory. But the plan depended on speed, coordination, intelligence, weather, and the capture of multiple bridges along a narrow route. One serious delay could endanger the entire operation. That is exactly what happened. The bridge at Arnhem proved too difficult to hold. German resistance was stronger than expected, communications failed, and ground forces struggled to advance quickly along the single road. Airborne troops fought with courage, but bravery could not repair the operation's structural weakness. The National Army Museum describes Market Garden as a costly failure, despite the determination shown by the airborne troops and supporting units. Market Garden was not foolish in imagination. It was dangerous in dependency. Too many essential pieces had to succeed at the same time. When the final bridge could not be secured, the whole design fell short. The lesson is brutal. A plan can be brilliant on a map and fragile in real terrain. Market Garden reached boldly for a shortcut to victory. But the shortcut became another battlefield. Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was meant to be a trap. The French hoped to draw Viet Minh forces into a decisive battle around a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, where French firepower, air supply, and fortified positions could destroy them. Instead, the trap closed in the opposite direction. French planners underestimated the Viet Minh's ability to move artillery through difficult terrain and position it in the surrounding hills. They also overestimated their own ability to keep the base supplied by air once the battle intensified. Under General Vuong Nguyen Giap, Viet Minh forces surrounded the French garrison, brought artillery into positions the French had not expected, and slowly tightened pressure. The French base became isolated. Airstrips were damaged, supplies became harder to deliver, and defensive positions were overwhelmed one by one. The battle ended in 1954 with a decisive Viet Minh victory, marking the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. The mistake at Dien Bien Phu was believing that technology and fortified positions could dominate geography and determination. The French saw the valley as a place where they could force the enemy into the open. The Viet Minh turned the hills into a siege ring. Dien Bien Phu shocked the world because it showed a colonial army being defeated by an opponent it had underestimated. The valley chosen for French strength became the place where that strength was trapped. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 was designed to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba, using a force of Cuban exiles trained and supported by the United States. The plan depended on secrecy, surprise, local uprising, and limited American involvement. Those assumptions failed almost immediately. The landing force faced stronger resistance than expected. Air support was limited and politically constrained. The expected popular uprising did not materialize. Once the invasion force became trapped on the beach, the United States faced a choice between escalating openly or accepting failure. President John F. Kennedy refused to commit full U.S. military power, and the operation collapsed within days. The U.S. State Department's historical summary identifies the Bay of Pigs invasion as a major Cold War episode whose failure shaped later U.S. policy toward Cuba. The mistake was not only military. It was political, psychological, and strategic. The planners expected a small force to trigger a much larger internal collapse. They misread conditions inside Cuba, overestimated the invasion's momentum, and underestimated how quickly Castro's forces could respond. The Bay of Pigs became a public embarrassment for the United States and strengthened Castro's position. Instead of removing him, the failed invasion helped push Cuba closer to the Soviet Union and deepened Cold War tensions. It remains a classic warning about covert operations. When a plan needs secrecy, local support, perfect timing, and deniable force all at once, failure can arrive faster than rescue. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.